with Chinatown, uh, all my early childhood memories of LA, just the sights, the sounds, and the smells, were something that drew me to that project. I know that sounds peculiar. We were having trouble with getting the last detail being made, and there'd been an article in the old This Week magazine, or West magazine, whatever it was, in the LA Times, and it was a piece called Raymond Chandler's LA. And in it there were photographs that had been taken in 1970, but done as if they were taken in 1930s, in the 1930s. You know, a Plymouth convertible in the rain under one of those old stippled street lamps outside of J.W. Robinson's. There was a Packard parked under a porte cochere in Pasadena, in the house, and I thought, my God, I hadn't really read Chandler at that point. I said, you know, you could still recapture the LA that I vaguely remembered by the judicious selection of locations around the city, many of which I knew and many of which were in San Pedro, because, as I indicated before, San Pedro hadn't changed much. And that got me started thinking. And I was in a battle with a building developer who was trying to destroy, really trying to flatten out a canyon in Benedict Canyon. And all around where I lived, and in particular where poor Quincy Jones lived, he lived in this little bowl that they were going to build around him. And I got to see the exquisite corruption in City Hall ramming this thing through, which I found fascinating and appalling. I went for walks where I remembered, you know, just the smells of the city I remembered as a child, and felt a great sense of loss of everything that was passing. So that had a personal impact for me. I quickly realized that detectives at that time were not tarnished knights who refused to do divorce work, but the successful ones were the guys who didn't do much of anything else, working for movie stars and people here trying to catch their mates in bed. And talked to guys like Freddie Otash, who's a name that probably nobody remembers anymore, but he was one of those kinds of detectives. And so I made my character in a way based upon Jack and upon a character that was like the actual detectives that worked, which were in some ways the very opposite of principal private eye characters. Very concerned about the way he dressed and his standing in the community. So yes, all those elements are part of it. It's, you know, it's always, it's never not personal, and it's never totally personal. And I think research and immersion in the world that you're going to write about, I think, gives you a feeling that you can't, that really is so helpful to film, which, you know, there's a lot to cover on that canvas, and you want it to have a certain reality that the script can suggest to the director and the actors.
Chinatown was such a tremendous success, and particularly a terrific success for you with an Oscar. And I only recently found out that it's number 3 on the list of 101 best films ever, best screenplays ever in the Writers Guild. Those are all really, you know, very exciting things to have happen. Besides how it must have felt at the time, did it change your career life very much at that time?
Oh, well, yeah, it did. I mean, it seemed, it had an air of unreality about it at the time, because, you know, when you're working on something, all I could see was everything that was going wrong with it. arguing with Roman about the script, looking at dailies and figuring they were all screwed up, thinking that nothing was working. But I had, like many people, I was kind of an anonymous character who had been rumored to have done script doctoring work on Bonnie and Clyde, on The Godfather, and all these other things, but I hadn't done anything on my own. And The Last Detail, Chinatown, and Shampoo were all scripts that for one reason or another were languishing and not being made. Columbia was worried about the language in The Last Detail, because while films had begun to enjoy a new freedom, David Begelman at that time was worried that there was a sort of counter-reformation, and he called me in one day and said, "Bob, wouldn't it be better if we had, wouldn't it be more dramatic if we had 20 motherfuckers instead of 40 motherfuckers, And I had to say, no, David, it wouldn't be. Actually, the whole point of it is that these men are lifers in the Navy, and swearing is not a sign that they're going to act, but it's kind of proof of their impotence, that they can't do anything but swear. So it would be highly destructive to remove the swearing or minimize it. In any event, all these scripts were languishing, and then all of a sudden, they were all done in consecutive years. So, between Last Detail, which came out first, and then Chinatown, and then Shampoo, which, as it happened, fell in different years, but were all done within a period of about 14 months. That had a real impact on my life and everything. Of course it did.
Mm. Going back to early days for a minute from the Sublime, I don't think I ever knew before I started reading about you for today that you had worked a little in television.
Oh God, yes, I had worked in television. I was the worst person to television is a whole different thing now, and I would hardly be the first person to say some of the very best writing in entertainment is in television now, but it was not so then. All of my training had taught me or suggested to me that so much of what I did as a screenwriter was to try to keep from writing something, was to try to keep from saying something, how to show it without saying it, and how to use dialogue, kind of contrapuntally to what was going on. When in our Last Detail, there's an argument in a cafe between Jack and Randy Quaid and Otis about sending a hamburger back so Randy Quaid could have it the way he wanted it. That was really have it the way you want it, That was really an argument about, stand up for yourself, live your life, don't be afraid to assert yourself. Otherwise you will be a perpetual victim and spend your life in situations that cause you to be going to jail for stealing $40 for 8 years, Not much dialogue was needed for that. It was the situation that was important. In television at that time, whatever the shows were, they were always insisting that you spelt everything out. And I was in agony over that. I had a horrible time and I did not do well with television.
Um,
Then, I mean,
right.
it's, as I said, it's entirely different now. I mean,
Are there things that you watch now?
well, I certainly was watching The Sopranos, and yes, there are things that I watch, but I can't. I mean, there's so much of it that's good. I can't keep up with all of it, so I'm kind of reduced to watching The Daily Show and The Colbert Report, and
Right.
things like that. How I work, I could say as little as possible. I mean, like a lot of writers, I avoid writing as much as possible. And I think that has gotten more pronounced over the years, partly because of the fact that um, as one's family grows, I'm not somebody who is good at being able to stop my child from asking about her homework, or some domestic problem in the house, because you always look like you're doing nothing as a writer. And I had an office that I gave up when my younger daughter was 5 or 6 and was very unhappy when I wasn't home when she came back from school, and I couldn't stand that. So I moved back to the house, and a separate house. But life is gets more rather than less intrusive. And the more your family grows and the more it comes to mean to you, the more reality has. And that ability to immerse yourself in fantasy and shut the world out becomes progressively more difficult. So that changes. I used to, I used to just sit and agonize, and then that moment where, that first moment where a story starts to carry you. I mean, you're constantly struggling. It's a little like a dance where you are the leader, and you're trying to move this clunky, clumsy creature around the floor. And then there comes a point where that creature sort of comes to life and starts to move you. Well, at that point, you become fascinated, and you're drawn to it. And so I would just work until I couldn't work, and then I'd go to sleep, and then I keep working. And so it was not unusual at all for me to work 2, 3, 4 in the morning. In fact, on the firm, I would work all night, and David Raphael and Sidney Pollack I would turn the pages, put the pages in his mailbox when I came home in the morning from my office, and they would work during the day. So, and then give me pages back, or so it went. That was the closest collaboration I think I've. That was. But as time has gone by, I mean, my hours have gotten more regular, and I don't necessarily think it's better for life. I don't think it's necessarily better for writing. I'm not somebody who, sits down, does his 3 or 4 hours, and gets up and goes about his business. I need to believe in the world that I'm in, and that's how I've always worked best. Starting and stopping has always been tough for me, and I've always had a hard time when I've had to do that. The biggest kick that I have ever gotten out of writing, and I suspect it's true of most writers, is are those times when you really don't know what's going to happen next, but you do know that you're going to find out that the material is yielding, and you're going to find out. I mean, that's exciting. That if you extend the analogy to fishing, you know that the fish are there, and you're going to catch one. You don't know what it's going to be, and that's the best possible feeling.
You said that the Sidney Pollack experience was the best, was the closest collaboration that you had had.
Well, in that way, I've certainly worked with people and had people talk the story over, and had people be very instrumental in helping me shape a story. I have a close friend who was invaluable to me. My wife has been very helpful, but has been instrumental in some instances. I mean, I remember, Sidney was, when we were working on the firm, he was saying, I don't see how you can let the mafia off the hook. And I came up with that scene with the Maralto brothers at the very end where he said, we've overcharged you, and they're looking for him. And if I can just get my hands on this Mitch McDear, this lawyer, who's turning us in, and then these two hoods, and their secretary says, excuse me, there's a Mitch McDear to see you. Send him in. And I wrote that scene in, I don't know, I was half dead, I hadn't slept. I wrote a 14-page scene, and I don't know, it had to be in about an hour. I mean, just, and I gave it to my wife, and I said, you're going to have to edit it. I can't do anything. I don't know what she did, but there was a 4-page scene there. And I read it to Sidney, and he laughed, and that became the scene. And I realized, so I mean, she was literally collaborating with me. I do know that, people can object to saying in principle something is wrong, but it's never wrong if a scene works. I mean, that's finally it. You really don't know, and the scene itself is the answer to whether something works or not. Now I'm struggling because to get some traction in doing a rewrite of my own script. But I don't know that that's terribly useful, because all that that's about is trying to find the time between things like this and Parents' Night, and the nephew of my wife's cousin here from Italy, and taking him to the gym, and my daughter's having a hematoma on her foot that needs looking at. I mean, just all the things that the real world just comes crashing in on your fantasy world, and people are more important. But when you're younger and you're more selfish, and you have to be, you're able to shut that out. I mean, one of the great things about directing, I think the best single thing about directing is nobody expects you to be anywhere else but on the set, and somebody can't say, well, you've got to stop and look at this or that. So there's no guilt associated with it. There you are.
When you're rewriting something that you're going to direct, is it different from rewriting something that you're handing off in terms of having to push yourself and not getting notes from someone or collaboration from someone?
Well, it's always good to have somebody who can help you, whether you're, one of the dangerous things about movie making is that I think, whether you want to own up to it or not, we all need collaborators. And we all do. And the more successful you become, the more successful your peers become that you've worked with, and you tend to go off and start doing your own movies, and sometimes the collaborations are not as prickly, they're not as adversarial, they're not as tough. People are more deferential. I didn't want to bother you, you know, and that doesn't always help for work. You know, I think that's a problem sometimes.
As you look back now, what are some of the best experiences that you've had, and if you have any not so great ones that you'd like to share?
Well, there are two kinds of experiences. There are experiences as a writer and experiences as a director. I enjoyed, I mean, my first directing experience, Personal Best, will be very special to me. And to quote Dickens, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And it took place over 2.5 years. It was quite a saga. I mean, we could easily do 2 hours on that. A movie starting and stopping because of strikes with athletes and not actors, and trying to get them together. Financing changing from a studio to independent financing, and having difficulties with the financier, having the film shut down, my stealing the film because of an argument with the producer, and not getting them to charge me with it because that would be a quick way into court, and they didn't want to do that. That went on. I mean, it was that's a fascinating experience, but I mean, that's a long story. I mean,
It's a movie.
It is. Well, it's a story worth. I mean, actually, it's a story worth telling. I loved working on Without Limits. I loved Oregon, Eugene, and it's where I first did Personal Best, and came back and did Without Limits years later with a very dear friend, Kenny Moore, who I co-wrote Without Limits with. He had been a teammate of Steve Prefontaine's. And what was interesting about that was that in 1975, a girlfriend of mine, Donna Di Verona, the Olympic swimmer, called and said there's a friend of hers that wanted to talk to me about a movie. And a fella called me about a guy called Steve Prefontaine. This was in 75, and I said, no, I'm busy. And several years later, I found myself in Eugene. And because of the nature of Personal Best, and because of the kind of reverence with which track is dealt with in Eugene, the idea of doing a track, a sports story there about two women who had a lesbian relationship, scandalized the campus, and it was unable to get any traction on getting people to agree with it, and it was insane. And the fellow that was helping me was on the phone to talk to the Oregon Track Club. And I turned away from him, and I heard the voice. And then I realized, I said, Kenny, you called me, this was 5 years ago, about Steve Prefontaine. And he said, yeah, you know, and I said, well, why didn't you say so? And I don't know. So it was the fellow who had called me about Prefontaine. And then 20 years later, we did Steve Prefontaine's story together. And of course, Kenny ended up being in Personal Best, too. But it was a great time. I mean, and I loved the athletes. And you know, I loved everything about it. My biggest disappointment in film was Greystoke, which I still feel is, even though it's unfinished, it's my favorite script. It was not the script that was shot.
That's the film that you took your name off of?
That's the one that my dogs got.
Your dog
My dog was nominated for an Academy Award on that one. And I always felt bad about that because I felt that he deserved a better screen credit. But that was a fascinating experience as far as it went. It took me to Africa, but I got caught between the writers. It was an actor's strike, and I'd started Personal Best, and I ended up losing the ability to do Greystoke. And which was ironic because I had started directing because of Greystoke, and I'd done certain tests on it because the script that I wrote, about an hour and 20 minutes of it was basically without dialogue. It was silent. It's a child being raised by apes. That was 2 or 3 minutes in the finished movie. And I realized that it seemed unreasonable to give a script like that to a director and then complain about what he did with it. It was very clear that the fellow who wrote it and imagined it had to do it. And in a way, Personal Best began as a sort of study for Greystoke, the movement of the athletes, because it occurred to me very quickly the way it does to all of us. If you can remember back to your high school days and in gym class, and you look at everybody usually wears the same, gray gym shorts and a white T-shirt. I don't care if they're 200 or 300 yards away. You instantly know who's who just by the way they're moving. And if you're going to be dealing with apes, you really want to specify the way each one moves and how much character can be suggested by movement. So character isn't just action, it's movement. And if you're in the way that 3 athletes moved in that script, Jodie Anderson and Patrice Donnelly and Marielle, very indicative of their characters. One who is just like John Henry is overpowering, one who is kind of perfect but limited in power, and one who's sort of like an ungainly colt who can't quite get her legs underneath her, but the day that she does is going to be something. But when you look at Cagney or Henry Fonda ambling down the streets in My Darling Clementine, and you realize how much character is delivered through movement. I loved working on both Personal Best and Without Limits, and I also had a great time on Tequila Sunrise. Although I was bitter about the fact that the studio insisted on an ending in which the hero lived, and in the script he died, and that would have made a world of difference to me because I think the movie, from my point of view, would have been infinitely better had the original ending, had I been able to have the original ending. But notwithstanding that, I had a great experience on it. Ask the Dust is another matter. It was a fascinating experience. I'd written the script years before and had a bitch of a time getting it made. Originally, I was going to do it with Johnny Depp. Ended up doing it with Colin, who was very good. But I don't know whether it was a passage of time. There's some things about the movie that are quite beautiful, but it's the only regret I have had in terms of casting. In all of the films that I've done, I felt Billy was everybody, everywhere. serve the material very well. And it wasn't his fault. But in the event, Colin was just too pretty for that character. It was too distracting. I think he was who we could get it made with, and I liked him and like him and think he's really a fine actor. I just realized that I needed a runt. Or, you know, it should have been much closer to an Italian Cagney. You know, and I think that I missed that part of the film. I've never said that before, but I've sure thought it. But the truth of the matter is I couldn't have gotten it made without Colin. He was loyal to the project. He ensured that it got made. And he did a really fine job. I just, you're asking me what I think after the fact.
It's a real balancing act to make something with somebody you
it's that,
think is right. And
it's just that, you know, you're pretty hard-pressed to find somebody as attractive in his way as Salma Hayek is in hers. And it was almost too much beauty.
John had a question. He said that a friend of his heard you speak somewhere, and you said that, or something to the effect of that you try to find the fear in every character. Is that accurate?
Well, I have said, and I think it's true, that one way of ensuring that a character has a certain level of reality is to try to figure out what that character is afraid of. It's surprising how little that happens. What's going to happen to you if you end up in movies is that your life experiences are going to become progressively narrower. It's unavoidable. I mean, you know, ours is a banana republic. And those life experiences that you bring to film, with the exception of the research that you're able to do in the world, which you're able to see, which are wonderful, you're going to be limited, and progressively more limited, your exposure to the civilian world, you know, whatever it is. I think you have to fight as long as you can to avoid that. I know this is not the normal advice given to young writers, but there was a dry cleaners near the place where I got my scripts typed years ago. And I remember going in there, and they also dry cleaned mink coats and stoles and things like that, and they would, you know, also did work sewing the pelts. And it came up that these ladies, and this was 40 years ago, were getting $500, $600, $700 a week to sew these pelts. And I said, Jesus Christ! I mean, it was, you know, that was a lot of money then. I said, how can they get so much money? And she said, well, they can only do it for so long. They start to lose their vision because of the fineness of the work. And it's an inevitable part of working in film if you're not careful. You start to lose your vision, cannibalize yourself. things like that. I mean, I think you've got to do everything you can to stay in touch with the world around you. That would, I mean, the usual advice about keep writing, write what you know about, work with your friends. All of that's true. But I mean, if you can't figure that out, fuck it. You just, then it's the advice I think you need when you get beyond that and you start working. That I would prefer to say about that. I mean, the unwillingness. Oh, it's good enough. I've done this before. I mean, so many directors and people. It's just so hard, fighting to get a movie made, fighting to get it finished, fighting for everything about it. That extra bit of work that you do to argue with one another, to get every bit of nuance that you're capable of bringing to it, there, it just begins to be a very tough struggle. And you've got to fight to keep doing that if your work is going to maintain itself. Before I even knew that I was going to work, I'm talking about when I was 7 or 8 years old, 6, and going to films, I used to be driven crazy by those things that I knew were not so. I knew that, something told me, even though I lived in San Pedro, that you couldn't always drive up to the Waldorf Astoria and park your car, that there wasn't always a parking space for somebody there. I thought, that's just not so. I knew from going to restaurants with my father that he always asked for the change. He didn't, it was never just giving the money and leaving without it, and I knew what my mother and father looked like when they woke up in the morning. And they didn't sleep in separate beds, and she didn't wake up with her hair done and her makeup on, I remember thinking, God damn it, when I do this, I'm going to make sure it's real. And sure enough, one way or another, whether it was in Bonnie and Clyde where she was counting out the change, or whatever it was, all of those things that drove me crazy were things that, the point is that I was determined to try to bring real, quote, real life, or life as I thought it was real, into movies, the way people really spoke, using language that would make a sailor blush. You use the language. You didn't, that I wanted to bring real life into movies. I didn't really have an interest in, even when I did Greystoke, I wanted to try to see what it was like to have a child raised by apes, really, as if it could really happen. I met with Jane Goodall. I did all of those things. I wasn't interested in doing what, say, George did when he did Star Wars. I wasn't interested in trying to revive in an interesting way an old genre, which is something that interested him, which was great, but it's just not something that held my interest. I certainly enjoyed his take on it, as I did with Indiana Jones, but I liked American Graffiti more. That's where I was interested. That was what my area of interest was. In terms of directing versus writing, the totality of the experience is such that inevitably I think of that, whereas I think of the writing as it was certainly meaningful to me, and the results of the successes of those films were very meaningful to me, and also what I learned in writing them. But the experience of directing, which calls everything into play, is something that one thinks about it, one talks about it, is overwhelming. I think that I remember being very frightened by the thought of oh God, where do you put the camera? You know, I had never gone to film school. I didn't have that much to do with cameras. And I remember Arthur and Warren arguing on Bonnie and Clyde, and Arthur saying, "Well, just wait till you figure out where to put the camera." And I realized when I got onto the set that I didn't know where not to put it because I'd so thought about it as I was writing it. And then the other thing that's worried me about it is often writers have, as this place would appreciate probably more than anywhere else, an adversarial relationship with the director, who, in the words of Philippe de Broca, a wonderful director, once said to me when we were working, he said, "Oh, Bob, that is such a good idea, but please, you must allow me to think I thought of it myself." You know, and there is that problem with certain directors. You know, I mean, and they can be autocratic, and I was, feeling depressed about having to be another in a long line of sadistic creeps. You know, which is, in my darker moments I could feel about certain directors, and I ran into, as I was brooding about this, Roger Vadim, who was a wonderfully charming man. And he said, "Bob, what's wrong?" And I said, "Well, I'm not going to direct Vadim, wonderful, but now I don't want to feel like some jackbooted fascist doing this shit." And he said, "Well, Bob," he said, as a director, it is possible not just to be as a father, but one may also be as a mother." And I thought, that's interesting, and the nurturing type, or someone who, who deliberately doesn't cut people off and allows people to say what they think, because you learn a lot on a set from the most surprising places. And I remember directing on Personal Best with my little 4-year-old, my older daughter, in my arms, because I could do that a lot, because a lot of it was shooting the running, and I realized the runners were acting, and sometimes acting too much. And so that, I would say to my daughter, "Now Daddy's going to make a shot, sweetheart." And it kind of made the set looser, and encouraged other people to help this poor doddering guy with his kid. And I got a lot of help that I think I would not otherwise have gotten with people. And I also found and felt that in many ways, in terms of traditional gender identity, that directing is a more feminine experience than writing. You are a reactor. You are someone who has to be able to find out how you feel in time for the next take, to tell somebody how you feel in a simple and articulate way. You are reacting to how people make you feel. Whereas in writing, you're generating things very often. So it's an interesting, it was an interesting and revelatory experience. And I think it always is.